Get a mix of local, national, and international news wherever you go and whenever you want it. And hear podcasts based on what you like. Download NPR at the App Store.
The Power Grab tells the story of how dark money and dirty politics led to the largest bribery scandal in Ohio history.
A $1.5 billion bailout in return for $61 million in dark money.
I'm Renee Fox. Listen to The Power Grab from WOSU Public Media, part of the NPR network.
This message comes from NPR sponsor GiveWell. There are over 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the United States and millions more around the world. How do you know which ones can make a big impact with your donation? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that goal. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. If you've never donated through GiveWell before, get your donation matched. Go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter NPR at checkout. This message comes from NPR sponsor Project Lead the Way. In today's changing world, every teacher deserves a STEM ally. Project Lead the Way is a proven national leader in science, technology, engineering, and math education for pre-K through high school. They strive to help teachers make every student in every grade STEM successful through interactive, problem-based learning. Learn more and find a school with Project Lead the Way near you at pltw.org/NPR.
The world order is changing in big ways. Ray Dalio studied the past to anticipate the future and shares his perspective in his best-selling book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Henry Kissinger called the book a serious contribution. Larry Summers said it's essential reading to understand our times. And Hank Paulson said, after reading this book, you probably won't see the world the same again. Available now in print and audiobook or as a free animated video on YouTube, which has been watched nearly 50 million times.
From the New York Times, I'm Michael Allora. This is The Daily. A little over a year ago, at President Biden's urging, congressional Democrats passed a sweeping plan to supercharge the production and sale of electric vehicles. Today, my colleague, Jim Tankersley, reports on whether the law is actually working. It's Thursday, November 16th. Jim, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you, as always, for having me.
So we're coming to you because you have been engaged in some old-fashioned accountability journalism. You've been trying to understand whether President Biden's signature climate bill is doing what it was designed to do. So tell us what you found.
I found a lot. So the climate bill, which you might recall was called the Inflation Reduction Act.
The Inflation Reduction Act invests $369 billion to take the most aggressive action ever in confronting the climate crisis.
It's the biggest climate investment in American history, and one of the centerpieces of that climate investment was to try to accelerate America's transition from what we might think of as regular gas-guzzling automobiles to electric vehicles.
Mm-hmm. American auto companies, along with American labor, are committing their treasure and their talent, billions of dollars in investment to make electric vehicles and battery and electric charging stations all across America. Made in America. All of it made in America.
And what a team of colleagues and I set out to find was, is that happening? Has the transition really been helped along by all of the tax credits in this bill and in the Biden agenda that are meant to push EVs forward?
Got it. And just in short, what's the answer to that question?
So the short answer is the law is trying to do two things at once. It's trying to have more electric cars and trucks made in America. Mm-hmm. And on that, we can say unquestionably it's a success. But it's also trying to get more Americans to buy electric vehicles. And on that, not so much, at least not yet.
And that, of course, feels important because if you can't convince Americans to walk into a car dealership and buy an EV, then what's the point of developing a system for manufacturing them in the country? So let's start, though, by focusing on how this law is working in getting EVs made in America.
So the law includes what are very powerful investment incentives for what is truly every step along the path of manufacturing an electric vehicle. Like starting from pulling the most important materials for an EV out of the ground and ending with recycling those materials once a battery has lived its full life and needs to be returned to something else.
So start with the very beginning, this battery, and walk us through how the incentives touch almost every point of the process.
Right. So there is a mining component to the Inflation Reduction Act. It is a tax credit for companies that pull out of the ground in the United States certain critical minerals that are used in the making of electric car batteries. And if you do that mining here, you get a production tax credit, which reduces your taxes and makes the project more attractive. The White House, for example, loves to tout a lithium mine in Nevada as an example of the sort of activity that's being encouraged by these incentives.
Okay, what's the next touch point?
So then you have the processing of those materials to be turned into batteries. And there you see a bunch of other investment across the country, including in North and South Carolina. Again, because there are tax credits that incentivize companies to set up mineral processing facilities to turn those raw materials into what you need to make batteries.
And of course that means there are new jobs in the Carolinas as well.
Exactly. And by the way, we're talking about billions of dollars of investment that otherwise probably wouldn't be happening if not for the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act passed.
Okay, so those are the batteries. How does this bill incentivize the rest of putting together an electric vehicle?
Well, we've got one more step on batteries, which is that you actually have to go to a plant now with the refined materials. And here is something where we've seen a really big boom of investment activity across the South. A lot of foreign automakers have announced plans to do their own battery making facilities in the United States that will create the batteries that then will go into their electric cars and trucks.
So this is pretty fascinating because just in the creation of a battery, this one component of an electric car, you're saying this bill has generated an entire ecosystem of businesses in a year.
Yes, totally. And it's really interesting. Some of that ecosystem is where you might expect it, where auto plants already are, like in Michigan. But other parts of this investment are like entirely new ecosystems, like in the Mountain West, which are interesting because it sort of shows the power of these incentives to break out of the traditional economic pathways that the auto industry has been in. And then we come to sort of the final piece of manufacturing an electric vehicle, which is the actual assembly plant. And here again, the law encourages investment by companies in doing that assembly, taking the battery and the rest of the car components, putting it all together and rolling it off to a dealer lot here in the United States. And again, it appears to be working. So, for example, Hyundai, the Korean automaker, is going to do its first U.S. electric vehicle plant in Georgia. A company called Scout, which used to make cars in the 60s and 70s, now they're coming back with EVs, and they're going to assemble them in South Carolina. You're basically seeing an EV supply chain grow out of almost nothing in the United States.
This feels like a really powerful reminder, Jim, that tax breaks, which we often joke about and sometimes we malign, have this tremendous force in our economy. And here, government tax breaks are fundamentally transforming an industry.
Yeah, the tax breaks were designed in this case to change the economics and the calculation that a company might make of where you want to build an electric vehicle. And they are very powerful, but they're not working alone here. They're not the only reason we're seeing this investment. There's a second part of the law that is really encouraging companies to spend money now to ramp up their electric vehicle sourcing and production in America. And that is tied to the question of how do you get more people to buy these cars?
Well, what is it exactly?
The law creates a $7,500 tax credit for most people to buy an electric vehicle. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It can definitely reshape a buyer's decision when you're comparing, you know, a Chevy Bolt versus a Toyota Camry. But there's a catch. To qualify for the credit, a car or truck has to meet certain requirements for how much of it is made and assembled in America. That's why there's so much money being poured into changing the EV supply chain so quickly. Because if you're an automaker and you want your vehicle to be able to get that big advantage of the government just throwing money at customers to buy an EV, you have to meet those made in America requirements, which means you need to be investing. And the requirements get tougher every year, so you need to keep building out your supply chain so you can keep meeting the requirements. It's sort of a long-term strategy, with the goal being you have to keep qualifying for the full $7,500 benefit. This year is the first year those requirements actually started. And that was pretty fast. The law just passed in 2022. So a lot of cars were just sort of left out in the cold. They didn't qualify for the full credit because their automakers hadn't had time to build up their supply chains. That means that customers weren't able to get the $7,500 each either. And so that's sort of why the law right now is doing a lot less to incentivize people buying EVs than it is to incentivize companies investing in making EVs.
We'll be right back.
The world order is changing in big ways. Ray Dalio studied the past to anticipate the future and shares his perspective in his best-selling book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Henry Kissinger called the book a serious contribution. Larry Summers said it's essential reading to understand our times. And Hank Paulson said, after reading this book, you probably won't see the world the same again. Available now in print and audiobook or as a free animated video on YouTube, which has been watched nearly 50 million times.
For over a decade, Rutherford County, Tennessee was arresting and jailing kids for even the most minor offenses. A boy accused of stealing a football jersey, jailed. A girl accused of pulling someone's hair, jailed. A girl trying to use a blank check at a school book fair, jailed. It happened so often to so many kids that getting sent to juvenile detention was almost a rite of passage. In many cases, what it also was illegal. I'm Maribel Knight, and this is the story of how that system came to be, how it came to be normalized, accepted, lauded even. It's also the story of two lawyers who did see the problem in Rutherford County. They just needed other people to see it too. From Serial Productions and the New York Times, this is The Kids of Rutherford County. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Jim, just before the break, you said that this law isn't doing enough to get consumers to buy electric vehicles, despite this $7,500 tax credit. Even if the law leaves some EV car makers out in the cold, like you said, I have to imagine it still does apply to plenty of EVs. So walk us through this kind of complicated dynamic.
Okay, first off, electric vehicles at the moment tend to be pretty expensive in the United States, which is why, if you want to get people to buy more of them, the government is offering them money. That's a pretty straightforward calculation. But they're also getting increasingly popular. This year, the country appears to be on track to buy about 1 million electric vehicles for the first time. That's a big deal. But it's still not very much in the context of the overall car market. Like, it's less than 1 out of every 10 cars and trucks sold in the United States is an EV. And Biden wants that to be significantly higher. And I think when we talk about the incentives not yet working to supercharge that buying market, the easiest way to look at it is that the rate of increase in EV sales actually went down last year after the law was passed. It's obviously still growing, but when you talk to car dealers, they mention a few obstacles that a lot of potential EV buyers still face when trying to decide between an EV or a conventional car.
Like what?
Cost is the big one. They say it's still too expensive, and particularly if the car doesn't qualify for the tax credit, which a lot of models don't, then it just doesn't pencil out for them compared to a cheaper alternative.
What if it does, though? Is that still a problem? The cost of a car, even with a $7,500 tax credit?
Well, you can really make a difference. Once you factor in the $7,500 credit, dealers will tell you that removes a significant barrier for a lot of buyers. But it's not everything. People still have other concerns too. They're still worried about, can I charge this car often enough and easily enough to get where I want to go? Something that people call range anxiety. Like, oh, I want to take road trips. Are there enough chargers along the highway for me to be able to do that and fuel up, like I can with a gas station with a conventional car? And right now, the government is racing to build out an infrastructure of chargers to expand on the one that's already in the United States, but it's just not big enough yet for a lot of people to feel comfortable. So those two issues, affordability and range anxiety, combine to make a difficult calculation for a lot of buyers. But when you talk to the dealers, affordability is the big one they come back to. They really say that if people have an incentive, it makes a difference. It makes it easier to sell people on the idea of taking a leap and trying an electric car.
Got it. So in that sense, one of the law's real limitations that perhaps it was unforeseen.
All right.
Your way as a driver. And that is simply a fact.
Renner notes that bus ridership is already back to where it was before the pandemic, and that the most nimble transit agencies in Richmond, and Cincinnati, and Tucson have more riders now than before. So does the light rail system in the Seattle area.
We expanded the service. We're reaching more people in more places, and so therefore we have more riders.
That's Julie Tim, CEO of Sound Transit. It's one of the few rail systems in the country that's seen a jump in ridership since 2019. Setting ridership records over the summer, Major League Baseball's All-Star Game, and a stop on the Taylor Swift tour.
What I think we're seeing as a victory here in Seattle as a virtuous cycle of you put the funding in, you keep a reliable service, and you see people use the service. When they have those good experiences riding, they come back, they ride again.
That's the opposite of a death spiral. That's where transit systems across the country are desperately trying to go. Joel Rosen, NPR News, Washington.
You have tried to run, you have tried to hide, but it did not matter. All the buzz around the Golden Bachelor has found you. I mean, it found me. I am glued to this show now.
How are you this evening?
Doing great, Gary. My name is Edith, and my heart has just been waiting to meet you.
Even for those of you who refuse to watch Gary Turner Looking for Love, this show keeps giving off these feel-good vibes and inspiring all kinds of think pieces about what it means to find love later in life, even as this show is rounding the corner to the big finale.
We're in Costa Rica, hope springs eternal. I'm in love with two women, but who would I be the happiest with for the rest of my life?
Our next guest has Bachelor fever for sure. Julia Littman co-hosts the podcast Bachelor Party for The Ringer. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to talk about why The Golden Bachelor has felt so different from previous Bachelors. I mean, obviously age is the main factor. The Bachelor and all these women are decades older than the usual group that we see on the show. How do you think that age factor has literally transformed the dynamic between all of these people, between the women and the guy, between the women themselves? What have you observed so far this season?
There are certain tropes that we've all become really familiar with. And by we, I mean the Bachelor professional community and the viewers, of course. And the tropes in some ways have just like fallen away, because even though I can tell you tonight is Fantasy Suites, the structure is the same, but all of the content is actually different, and it's so refreshing. It's very hard to have a fresh take on a format that's been airing since 2002. So it's really, I think, captured people's attention because it's like disarmed them.
The sincerity, the earnestness.
Yeah.
And the women aren't as catty in this season as they are in usual seasons.
Yeah, they're catty in a different way. There was Kathy, who
Kathy.
Was probably the cattiest, but in some ways, even she was refreshing because she would just do it she had issues with Teresa, who's now in the final too, but she brought it to Teresa and was like rude to her face. And there's something that's like refreshing and a relief about seeing her be direct about it versus only to the camera or behind a fellow contestant's back.
Right, and be passive aggressive instead. Right.
Yeah.
When you're older, you just say what's on your mind.
Exactly. And I think I have just really loved seeing these older women come with the confidence of just having lived more life. And so, you know, last week on the reunion, the Women Tell All, as it's called in Bachelor Nation, they like talked a lot about flatulence and they talked a lot about friendship. And so it doesn't come with the same self-consciousness of how this will impact your social media following or what are the career opportunities later.
Well, do you think, given the success of this first season of The Golden Bachelor, that dating shows or all these finding your love shows out there might be switching into a different gear? Like, what have we learned that might be applied to other kinds of shows like this?
One thing about Gary that I think is hard to replicate, his kindness is incredibly appealing, and I think reality TV over the last 2 decades or so has skewed towards being a little bit more cynical and treating more in like people being mean to each other and being cutthroat. And I think this show is a testament to the fact that people also really like to watch kindness and joy and
decency.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe I'll consider dating someone in his 70s. Okay. The Ringers, Juliet Littman, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was really fun to talk to you.
You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Ooma, a cloud-based phone service for any size business with an automated virtual receptionist, video meetings, and other features to connect to customers and coworkers anywhere at ooma.com/NPR. From Procter & Gamble, maker of Metamucil, a fiber supplement containing psyllium, a plant-based fiber for trapping and removing waste in the digestive system, designed to be taken every day. More at metamucil.com. From the NPR Wine Club, where members can explore wines from around the world, and every purchase supports NPR's high-quality journalism. Available to adults 21 or older. nprwineclub.org. And from the Doris Duke Foundation.
Support comes from The Wine Merchant, celebrating 50 years of serving the greater Cincinnati area. Their knowledgeable staff can help you select the wines to pair with your Thanksgiving feast. You can experience The Wine Merchant's ultimate wine station anytime with 16 different wines to taste before you buy. Shop in-store or online at winemerchantcincinnati.com. Support comes from Cincinnati's Ronald McDonald House, which keeps families with critically ill children together while they seek life-saving medical care far from home. Your support gives them the care they need and eases financial and emotional burdens. You can learn more about ways to give at rmhcincinnati.org. That's rmhcincinnati.org.
Southbound 71 at Pfeiffer, a wreck in the right lane. Northbound 75 after Union Center Boulevard, wreck on the left shoulder. Grog Run Road still closed between Hampton Glen Lane and Harrison Road near Loveland.
91.7 WVXU Cincinnati and 88.5 WMUP Oxford. News from Cincinnati Public Radio and NPR.
I think the problem is just much bigger worldwide than we even really realize.
Could a new agreement with China actually reduce the amount of fentanyl in the United States?
For Thursday, November 16th, this is All Things Considered from NPR News.
I'm Ari Shapiro.
And I'm Elsa Chang. Coming up, the spike in threats against Jewish and Muslim communities in the U.S.
We'll get the view from the Department of Justice.
No person and no community in this country should have to live in fear of hate-fueled violence.
Later, authors fight back against artificial intelligence.
It was regurgitating everything. It knew my characters, it knew their names, it knew the settings, it knew everything.
And the author Justin Torres, whose novel Blackouts won the National Book Award for Fiction last night.
Those stories after this news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Speer. The leaders of the UN and other international aid groups say they will not take part in so-called safe zones in Gaza unless all parties agree. They also want a humanitarian ceasefire. Comes as negotiations to release hostages held by Hamas continues. More from NPR's Michelle Kelman.
No safe zone is truly safe when it's declared unilaterally or enforced by the presence of armed forces. That's one of the points made by humanitarian leaders. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller says the U.S. is talking to Israel to find better ways to protect civilians in southern Gaza.
It's a conversation that's ongoing with the Israeli government right now.
The Biden administration has rejected calls for a ceasefire, though it supports temporary pauses to allow aid in, and it has supported negotiations for a deal that would see Hamas release some hostages in return for a longer pause in fighting and the release of some Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Michelle Kellerman, NPR News, the State Department.
A judge in Fulton County, Georgia, is issuing a protective order over some sensitive evidence in the election interference case against former President Donald Trump and 14 others. Prosecutors pushed to safeguard evidence after leaks to the media of interviews with Jenna Ellis, Sidney Powell, and others. Member station WABE, Sam Greenglass has the story.
Prosecutors and most defendants ultimately compromised on a narrow protective order, allowing prosecutors to designate specific evidence, like some witness interviews, as confidential until trial. Here's Judge Scott McAfee at a hearing this week.
This case should be tried not in the court of public opinion, but before a jury and with evidence that has been vetted and approved.
Prosecutors also worried that releasing sensitive materials publicly could result in threats and harassment that discourage witnesses from cooperating. A trial date has not been set for Trump and his 14 remaining co-defendants. For NPR News, I'm Sam Greenglass in Atlanta.
Former President Donald Trump has maintained a large lead in most states ahead of Republican primary contests. That includes Florida, where one of his main challengers, Ron DeSantis, is governor. Here's Ashley Lopez reports.
Sally Malte lives in Hollywood, Florida, and she says she used to support her governor, Ron DeSantis, until he decided to run for president.
And I'm a little upset that he's out campaigning as president because I voted him to do a job here as governor, and while he's out campaigning, he's not doing his governorship job. And I'm not the only Floridian that feels that way.
Malte says she's supporting Trump and has no interest in any other candidates, which is a sentiment among many base Republican voters. This is partly why DeSantis is currently struggling to gain support in a state he won in a landslide during his gubernatorial re-election just last year. Ashley Lopez, NPR News.
The next close on Wall Street, the Dow dropped 45 points, the Nasdaq rose 9 points. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Jarl and Pamela Moore, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts. And the Public Welfare Foundation, committed to advancing transformative youth and criminal justice reforms.
Good evening. It's 6:04, 63 degrees in Cincinnati, 61 degrees in Dayton. This is 91.7 WVXU. I'm Bill Reinhardt. For the second year in a row, utility rates for Metropolitan Sewer District will go up. Hamilton County Commissioners voted today to approve a 3% increase. Last year, commissioners approved a similar rise to maintain MSD's current services and to fund projects. Commission President Alicia Reese was the only no vote. She says although MSD has rate reduction programs for seniors and for those struggling financially, she wants to keep rates down to help those who don't qualify.
Middle class getting wiped out because there's nothing. You can't get a break. You either got to be super poor or super rich. The people in the middle, they got to pay everything on time and on the dime. We don't have nothing for them, and they're saying they're struggling. It's not just MSD by itself. It's everything going up. Checks are going down.
MSD says it worked with the county to keep the rate increase as low as possible. The new rate will go into effect at the start of the new year. An Indiana legislative task force dedicated to developing a road funding plan has wrapped up the first half of its work. An actual plan will come ahead of the 2025 budget session. Much of yesterday's meeting centered on alternative fuel vehicles like electric cars and what they'll mean for state revenues. What is certain is state gas tax, a primary source of road funding, will eventually decline as electric vehicles become more common. Douglas Schenkel from the National Conference of State Legislatures says a few other states have introduced fees drivers pay at public electric vehicle charging stations.
I think this is really oriented towards capturing revenue from an out-of-state electric vehicle driver.
Schenkel says those fees don't yet amount to much, but he expects them to grow as the number of electric vehicles and charging stations grow. Members of the Wilberforce University Band and Choir are celebrating a Grammy nomination. They're part of the HBCU Symphony, a gospel ensemble from 10 historically black colleges and universities. The symphony is heard on poet Jay Ivy's album, The Light Inside, which was nominated for the Grammy's 2024 Best Spoken Word Poetry Album.
It's All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Ari Shapiro in Washington.
And I'm Elsa Chang in Culver City, California. One of the outcomes of President Biden's meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping yesterday was an agreement over fentanyl. The agreement is to curb the flow of the precursor chemicals that are used to make synthetic opioids like fentanyl, which originate in China. Realistically, what would it take for China to seriously constrain this? Well, to discuss that, let's bring in Ben Westhoff. He's an investigative journalist and the author of Fentanyl Inc., How Rogue Chemists Are Creating the Deadliest Wave of the Opioid Epidemic. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Elsa.
Well, thanks for being with us. So, this agreement between Presidents Biden and Xi to curb fentanyl production, it isn't the first of its kind, right? Like, there was an agreement back in 2019 between former President Trump and Xi on this very same issue. But is there something that stands out to you now that makes this announcement any different and makes you believe that the results we will see will be different?
The 2019 agreement was widely heralded, and it was to ban fentanyl analogs, which are types of fentanyl, and they're drugs themselves. People take those, overdose, and die. This agreement focuses on the ingredients to make those chemicals. And so the 2019 agreement actually did work.
Oh.
We saw less of these chemicals on the street, but what happened was these Chinese chemical companies just shifted to making these fentanyl precursors, aka fentanyl ingredients. And so now that's the problem.
And do you think that this new agreement between President Biden and Xi Jinping will produce a more effective result? That is, we will see a noticeable difference in the amount of fentanyl flowing in the U.S.?
I think there could be a short-term difference. What happens is that these Chinese chemical companies sell the precursors to Mexican cartels who finish them and send them north of the border. And we might see less of that for a while. But the problem is that Mexican cartels are very adaptable.
I see. Well, let's talk about your reporting from China. You're one of the only, if not the only, reporter to get access to one of the fentanyl manufacturing labs in China. What was your main takeaway from that?
I couldn't believe how this was being done on such a huge scale. You know that only 2 grains of rice worth of fentanyl is enough for someone to overdose and die. But in these labs and companies where I visited, I saw these huge quantities being made, you know, kilos and kilos and kilos. And these were some small labs too. And so I think the problem is just much bigger worldwide than we even really realize.
Is there one metric that you will be looking to assess if this particular